Um, we're a small group here, so I think we can do this informally and be heard by those people joining us virtually. But I think you've gotten a sense that we're at a phase in our movement where we have to have a vision that encompasses the LGBT community on a massive scale. And so in low and middle income countries, that means an estimated 500 million LGBTIQ people are facing health disparities, disparities in education, employment, income. We need to be able to respond and make sure each and every one of those people is given the opportunities that they should have. That means in low and middle income countries reforming healthcare systems, education systems, justice systems. There are 65 million nurses in those countries and health paraprofessionals, 17 million teachers, 12 million justice officials. That's going to take a huge amount of money. And so that's why I want to talk today about the World Bank, which represents, I think, the single largest flow of development funding. Together with the other four major development banks, is $200 billion per year. And I think a long-term vision says and asks, why can't a certain amount of that $200 billion be spent on government programs targeting improvements in the lives of LGBTIQ people? So what I want to do today is have you leave with some sense of what the World Bank does and how we could influence that. And so with me, let me see, we have Biljana Genova, and I don't know what you can see, Biljana, but hello. Biljana is in Skopje right now. She's from they're from Northern Macedonia. Oh, good, the first misgendering of the day, and I did it from the podium. I apologize, Biljana. Biljana is in Skopje and is one of those people who has just been in the leadership or a participant with many of the groups in the Western Balkans and Turkey. I first met Biljana as part of a research project that we were working on with the World Bank about economic inclusion in the Western Balkans. We also have Robert Zapato from El Salvador, from a group called Amate, which has been engaging with the World Bank there, and he has some very interesting experiences to tell us. And then Rachel Burton is the Director of Social Inclusion at the Bank Information Center. BIC is the kind of expert boutique organization that helps people advocate at the World Bank, and BIC has been a partner with me and Outright in beginning activities in this area. So first, I wanted to talk about what the World Bank is, but we should probably start with what the World Bank isn't, because the misconceptions about the World Bank have been a real challenge for us to confront. So let me start with Biljana. Biljana, if we were to ask the average LGBTIQ activist what the World Bank does, what might they say?
Yes, thank you, Andrew. And first, thank you for the invitation to join to this panel, and thank you for the flexibility allowing me to join virtually since I was not able to travel. As you rightfully put, yes, there are many misconceptions among LGBTIQ activists about what the bank is. And I think that is mainly due to lack of, how can I say, readily or easily accessible information on what's everything the bank does inside the LGBTIQ movement. So one main misconception is that, pardon, that the bank is primarily focused on economic development, that is exclusively what the bank is interested in, and that's why they're working with the states or the business sector, the big corporations to ensure development, but mainly with focus on the economic development. In line of this, activists in general think that the bank is not interested about any social issue, including the position or the right of LGBTIQ people or other disadvantaged groups, and that's in a way there is not a reason why should we advocate or engage with the bank. Another misconception in this line is that the bank is this large or mystic or enigmatic institution that is completely inaccessible for some organizations, some movements or organizations who are not maybe working on a global level, such as Outright or ILGA, etc. But I'm talking about some country-based or local town-based organizations. And there is also another misconception that this is a private entity, that is not a public institution, that should be also care about the social or environmental aspects of development. And finally, what is important to mention, it is not a misconception. It is there is also another group of LGBTIQ organizations who are more or less aware what is the World Bank and what they do. However, they are critical to engage with the World Bank due to the anti-capitalist notion of the LGBTIQ movement.
Let me ask, go to the other side. Rachel, what do you think are other misconceptions about the bank?
One of the biggest misconceptions that we have heard from the LGBTQI+ community is that the World Bank funds civil society organizations, and in a very small way, it can. But the misconception oftentimes leads organizations to go in and instead of doing advocacy on $500 million projects, unfortunately, they're going in asking for money. And so that is one of the biggest misconceptions that we have seen over the course of our work, is identifying really what is the value add of the World Bank and how can you do effective advocacy in that.
So we're going to disprove many of those misconceptions, but in terms of groups seeking funding from the bank, this has been a particular problem because it's caused a lot of conflict. There have been reports of philanthropic giving that have listed bank funding for LGBT groups as grants. And I'm going to ask Dominic. Hello, Dominic. So those reports, what money are they talking about when we talk about World Bank funding for LGBTI groups? Dominic is with the World Bank, so I'm going to put him on the spot, and he didn't realize this, so turn your microphone on.
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, good morning, everybody.
Surprise.
My name is Dominic Koller. I'm a social development specialist at the World Bank working on sexual orientation and gender identity inclusion. So what was included in these reports is lending operations. So this is money that governments borrow from the World Bank that in some shape or form had a SOGI element to it, or it's money that we have that we've put into research. You have mentioned the economic cost of exclusion research that we've just completed in North Macedonia and Serbia. That is money that was counted towards what the World Bank is providing to the LGBTI movement. But as Rachel rightfully put it, this is not money that goes directly to civil society organizations. This is, for example, money that goes out to recruit survey participants, to execute a survey, or in the case it is part of a loan, it's money that goes to the government for service delivery or for consultations or for other issues.
So fee-for-service contracts, basically, not grants. But what the World Bank does do is lend money to governments that need it to do all these very important things. So let me ask Rachel, how does the bank decide what it's going to do? And what's the process of the bank figuring out where its money will go?
So some of this starts from what is called the country partnership framework and the systematic country diagnostic. I will try as much as possible not to talk in acronyms, but the World Bank really does love its acronyms. And so really what that does is lays out the foundation for funding priorities in a country over a 3 to 5 year period. And really the way in which the World Bank works, and in all of our advocacy meetings that we go into, is usually the bank says, we are client driven, meaning driven by the governments of particular countries in terms of what they are coming to the bank asking for. So as Dominic mentioned, this is money, loans and grants that would potentially go to build a road or support the social protection system in a country or to fund education services in a particular country. So really a government is coming to the World Bank saying, we would like to invest in a new road. We would like money for that. And then the negotiations begin there. But really the ultimate framework here is the country partnership framework, which is, again, identifying that roads are a priority, education is a priority, health is a priority in this particular country. And then that kind of sets the tone for where the World Bank funding will go over that period of time. But again, it is really the government coming to the bank asking for particular money for a certain type of project or for support in a specific sector.
And the bank is decentralized, so this happens at the country level, not at headquarters. So, Roberta, you've been doing advocacy with the country office in El Salvador at the bank. Can you tell us what has happened in terms of the relationship between LGBT issues, the community, and the bank's planning process? What's your experience been?
Well, hello and good morning, everyone. I have to say that we've been involved in these advocacy actions since 2020, and it's been an interesting experience, very different from what we have done in the past with government institutions or with other like international agencies. So let's say that we have seen that the people from the bank is open to meet with us or is open to invite us to certain consultations. But at the same time, there are many challenges, especially when it comes to organizations that are not, let's say, trained on what the World Bank is and what expectations can they have about the role the bank can have in certain areas. So, for example, and I'm talking about the misconceptions, some people might go there and start talking about like the human rights language, and the bank is usually not the same language that they use. It's obviously human rights related, but it's not the same words. So they talk more about development, and that's one of the issues they have, because these activists, let's say, hope that these people might understand that, and they might actually do it, but they are limited in terms of what they can do. So even though we have met with the bank and there are certain things that have moved forward, so for example, out of 7 projects that are currently active in El Salvador, financed by the World Bank, 6 of them include the LGBTI community as a stakeholder. And back in 2019, there was none, and there was any project that would include the LGBTI community as a stakeholder. And that's something. It means that the World Bank is recognizing that this group, that our group has interest on whatever they are doing. But is this translated in actions specifically benefiting the LGBTI community? I think in one part, yes, but at the same time, there's a lot of room for improvement.
So when we talk about World Bank projects, that means a loan. So there's 7 active loans. One loan will be to health, one loan will be to education, things like this. And each of these loans is billions, so it's not a small amount. And so the goal then is to try to get funding for targeted programs for LGBTIQ people. Biljana, do you have any examples of projects that have benefited LGBTIQ populations?
Yes, but Andrew, with your approval, before I go to the example, I want to just continue to what Roberto was talking now about not just the language, human rights and development language. I think one of the weaknesses that we have that limits the engagement of LGBTIQ communities, organizations with the bank is that also there is no training. For example, in the context of Western Balkan or Eastern Europe, we have engaged with EU mechanisms, with UN mechanisms, etc. But to do so, we have extensive training and collaboration with these institutions, so LGBTIQ organizations can understand exactly how these big institutions, because UN is also a huge mechanism, right? So we learn how these mechanisms works, how it functions, what are the bodies, what is the hierarchy, and most importantly, what are the entry points. Where are the entry points, openings to talk about concerns of LGBTIQ issues? Because the language, is it human rights or development, we can learn it. However, it's more difficult to understand how the World Bank functions. What are the entry points? How can we, organizations, for example, in Macedonia, engage in the country partnership framework preparation. How can we engage? How can we be invited for a stakeholder engagement, etc., etc. So I just wanted to use this opportunity to urge, because I hear there are people from the bank in the audience, that this kind of training should not come only from big or outright, but they should come from the bank as well, because that is a step how the bank ensures, and the bank is public institution, right, and works with public money. So it's in a way their responsibility to ensure that everybody, especially those of us who are most disadvantaged, to learn how this big institution functions and to make sure that we know how to properly engage with the bank. So thank you for giving me that time. One of the good examples because there are good examples, and I again agree that there is a lot of place for improvement, but also we have good examples to build on. One is the case in Argentina, where the collaboration between the civil society sector, the World Bank, and the state created in a way a systematic solution to breaking barriers for transgender and non-binary people in accessing education and employment. So probably people in the audience already know that Argentina is leader in a way in the advancing the rights of these populations. Key legislation is in place. However, transgender and non-binary people historically and now they're facing numerous barriers. They are facing stigma and discrimination and violence, limited access to education, limited access to employment, and everything that goes with it. However, this collaboration, in a way, advanced a scholarship program. The name of the scholarship program is Progressor. To be much more inclusive, or to create special measures to include transgender and non-binary people who left the school because of stigma, violence, and discrimination, to come back to school with the support of this scholarship, and eventually to improve the chances for employment. And why this program, why I choose this example, because there are other examples also, but I choose this example because in this they don't just tackle economic barriers, right, education, employment, etc., but they also tackle the social barriers in the society, because when the support comes from the state, but not some private foundation, an NGO, etc., it sends very loud and clear and very powerful message to the society that this group who have been systematically excluded, now we try to build a way how to be systematically included in all the processes in the society. And with this program, only in 1 year, more than 8,700 students have received scholarship, and the data shows that increased enrollment in the schools and improved graduation rates, which of course will improve the access to employment. Thank you.
And from another development bank, the Asian Development Bank, we have examples. For instance, Bangladesh has approached the Asian Development Bank for funding to look at their healthcare system and figure out how to incorporate the Hijra population. The Bangladesh healthcare system has to serve a massive amount of people, and that's going to be a very expensive task. The government of Nepal has approached both the ADB and the World Bank for funding to do a third gender count in the country. And so we have various governments that are supportive in one way or another coming to the bank asking for things that are far beyond the ability of philanthropic resources to do. But both of you have raised the issue of what do activists need to be effective advocates? The LGBT community has traditionally been a human rights one, so instead of talking about fulfillment of rights, we talk about improvement of outcomes. Instead of talking about universal rights, we talk about targeted goals. Any other thoughts you have about speaking development language as opposed to human rights language?
Well, I think that one other thing that's very important when it comes to advocacy or advocating the World Bank is to, let's say, besides have training, that's very important, is to be patient. Because, you know, let's be honest, and the bank is a really big institution with a lot of bureaucracy. And so if it's difficult for us to do advocacy with government institutions that are certainly big, imagine to do it in the bank, the World Bank. So
where the average project cycle is 6 years, 8 years?
Yeah, it depends. But for example, and this is probably one of the reasons we've seen that certain CSOs are not really, let's say, interested in do advocacy with the bank because they don't see results quickly.
Yeah.
And they are probably thinking that they can have more, I don't know, results if they use their resources or their people in other projects. But at the same time, if you are patient and if you like follow up in time, I believe that certain changes can be done. Probably there will be certain barriers, especially if you don't have a government that is open to the LGBTI topics, like you said. It's more difficult, and that's the case of El Salvador because we currently don't have a government that's open to sexual diversity at all. In fact, we have a lot of setbacks in the past years. And so things like, for example, access to data, or if there are certain data in government institutions, that's one of a big issue for us. Or if there are no data created, then that's another issue. So if we had probably these two things, it would be easier for us to do advocacy at the bank and at many other institutions. But I believe these are two of the main challenges for us too.
So that's our first goal with the bank, is to get the bank to finance governments to do programs to benefit LGBTIQ people. The second goal is to get the bank to use its global leadership to promote the inclusion of LGBTIQ people in development generally. And one of the ways that it does this is commissioning research. And that's one of the things that this money goes to pay for that Dominic was talking about. Biljana, you've been involved in several research projects. Do you want to give an example of the research that the World Bank has promoted?
Yes, thank you, Edgar. I think I would like to share the example in my country because and also it's the most recent example in the region, and that is the cost of soju-based exclusion. And that was, again, it's a good example of a collaboration between the bank and the CSO sector, because when the methodology was developed, the World Bank approached LGBTI organizations on the ground, approached us, and we went through the questionnaire together. We went through the models of collection data, etc. And I think it is important that the bank was very open to the suggestions coming from the LGBTI community, because to create good research, first, it is important that the language is tailored to the community from which you're collecting data now. So the terminology that the local communities are using, the formulation of questions, etc., were accepted by the bank. So this was the first step. Further, the collaboration continued also in the dissemination of the questionnaire and collection data, because again, in collaboration between us and the bank, we tried to find a way how to reach the hard to reach communities like LGBTIQ people in small towns, transgender people, people who don't have access to technology because the collection of data was online, etc. So in that collaboration,
if I could interrupt for a second,
Yep.
What we're talking about is development data, and the development framework says, here's the process. The process
Yep.
is, first, you look at the entity, the country, the person, the community that you want to improve their development. Secondly, you make an intervention, and then after the intervention, you look at them again to see how that intervention worked. So the first step is looking at the community.
Yep.
With regard, if you're looking at the community's health, you need to know, how healthy are they? How much money do they make if you're looking at income? Where do they live if you're looking at housing? How much school have they gone to? We don't know that for most LGBTIQ people on the planet. We don't know even the basic piece of information, which is, what is the life expectancy of a person in a particular country? So this is the kind of survey that was being produced to try to get an idea of the LGBTIQ LGBTQ community's development outcomes. And so go ahead and continue.
Yeah.
Leah.
No, thank you, Andrew, for the intervention. I wanted to present the whole picture that in every step, because as you said, to collect that data that are not existent, also the methodology, how do you collect that data needs to be in place. And okay, we want to emphasize that we really had good cooperation with that in that part. And then when we enter into data analysis provided by the research team at the bank, and producing this report was actually for us very important advocacy tool in a way, because the survey showed that approximately 0.5% of the GDP in North Macedonia and in Serbia is lost due to the SOGS based violence and SOGS based exclusion. And these numbers are not neglectable. They are, especially for our small economies, these numbers are quite impactful, and then it helps us to use them to advocate in a way for inclusion of LGBTIQ people also in the development processes, not just human rights frameworks. So yes, thank you.
You know, and this notion about the relationship between discrimination and the economy is something that LGBTIQ advocates are learning how to explain. You have a worker, they work at 100% of their effort, but then they're facing health issues because of exclusion or discrimination, so that brings their productivity down a little bit. They didn't get as much education because of bullying, so that brings their productivity down a little bit. They didn't get as much work experience, so they're not working in the jobs that they should, so that brings down their productivity a little bit. So then a portion of your workforce, 5–10%, is now, instead of 100% productive, 80%, 75%. So your overall workforce, the productivity is lower. That means companies make less profits. That means the entire national economy is decreased. And you said it was a 0.5%.
Yeah. Is it okay if I add something that important that I forgot? Because of the specificity of the study was focused only on the labor market. So this estimated 0.5% of the GDP are only based on the exclusion in the labor market. If we are to extend this survey to access to social services, access to other aspects to life, the speculation is that this number could increase up to 1.7% of GDP. So that is again very significant number that in a way quantifies the economic impact of social-based discrimination.
And I think, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a 1% decrease in GDP sustained over 2 6-month period is officially classified as a national recession by the IMF. So that 1% is a big deal. That's a 1% that can bring a government down, or so it's only 1%, but it's a big one. I'm going to move to our third goal. So that is an example of how the World Bank can kind of use its leadership to make that argument to the development community that LGBTIQ people matter. The third goal is, what do you do in countries that are very hostile, where there's no chance the government is going to go to the World Bank and say, we'd like money to fund a program to benefit LGBTIQ people? And the main advocacy tool that we have in these kinds of countries is called the Environmental and Social Framework. It's almost kind of like the human rights policy of the bank. And I want to have Rachel, it's quite a complicated thing, but that's the framework we're using. So Rachel, could you explain that very quickly and succinctly?
You're giving me the impossible task. I will try. So the Environmental and Social Framework is the World Bank's safeguards. And so I'm sure a lot of you have heard about safeguards. Back in 2012, the World Bank decided to update its safeguards. And so it went through quite a long process. And this new Environmental and Social Framework was approved in 2016 and went into effect in October of 2018. And previously, what the safeguards focused on, which was much more environmental harm.
Which is the basis of the term safeguard.
Yes.
So we're safeguarding the environment against the harms of building a road, building a dam, etc.
Exactly. And so with this new environmental and social framework, first of all, there is a social component to this. This is not just focused on environmental harms. But one of the biggest pieces is that this is not just focused on harm. This is focused on access to project benefit. And so that's really a lot of the hook for our advocacy moving forward, is how do we enable LGBTQI+ people to access project benefits? Yes, we need to be looking at what harms are happening as a result of exclusion, but really focusing on that access to benefits piece. And so the way in which the safeguards actually work is, again, when the government gets money to build a road, what you're looking at is what are the environmental harms that will happen as a result of road construction. So a lot of the pieces come along, a lot of dust and dirt being happening as a result of the construction, potential resettlement, who has to move as a result of where the road is going through. Is this disrupting access to social services like health or education? Things along those lines, and really making sure that when the World Bank is funding a project in a country, that the outcomes are not worse as a result of that investment, and that everyone is able to benefit. So that's really the key piece here, as well as this is the first time that now there is a requirement for stakeholder engagement in projects. And this is really key, because this is where project affected peoples as well as other stakeholders within the country can come in and say, I am particularly concerned about this education project because you haven't considered issues around bullying, and that is a huge issue and that needs to be addressed. Or this, you're investing this in the social protection system, and actually I don't see anything related to LGBTQI+ people and how they can access the social protection system. So really engaging as early as possible in the stakeholder engagement process enables change at the project level and is really key to the way in which advocacy can be shaped moving forward.
And so the rule, check me on this, the rule is that the bank should not fund a project that harms people or that excludes disadvantaged or vulnerable populations.
Correct, yes. And so LGBTQI+ people are considered disadvantaged. I'm using quotes here because I don't like the terminology disadvantaged or vulnerable groups, but that is the umbrella terminology under which LGBTQI+ people fit. And so really, this is the environmental and social framework is framed around non-discrimination.
So now I want to get to Uganda, because when Uganda passed the Anti-Homosexuality Act, that act did a bunch of things, including placed a burden on all people in Uganda to report to the police anybody whom they have a reasonable suspicion might engage in an act of homosexuality. So if I tell you I'm I don't know, what do you call a person that plays a guitar? A guitarist? Okay. If I tell you, like, I'm a guitarist or a hiker, you can reasonably suspect that I've played a guitar or I've gone for a hike. If I tell you that I'm openly LGBT or that I'm a homosexual, you can reasonably suspect that I've engaged in an act of homosexuality. So this rule, this law, requires people to be reported to the police if they are openly LGBT. And it outlaws doing all kinds of things like communicating support for LGBTIQ people, arranging meeting space, facilities, etc. So the World Bank made a determination that all of its activities that it was financing, being carried out by the Uganda government, would necessarily have to exclude LGBTIQ people because of this law. So they did something which I think was kind of surprising to many people, but when the activists in Uganda made the decision, we want to request that the World Bank cut off money to Uganda in order to pressure Uganda to repeal the law. The World Bank looked at their rule and said, yes, you're right. We cannot continue to give loans and comply with the economic and social framework. So that was the basis. It first began with a request by local advocates to do that. So it wasn't an outside thing imposed. So now that the loans have been suspended, they were suspended in early August, the burden now shifts to the government to prove that it can mitigate this harm. So if it were a road, it would mitigate the harm by, if it had to put people off of their land, by compensating them, giving them job opportunities, et cetera. So they are now, where we are is that the government is now trying to articulate ways that it can mitigate the harms of the Anti-Homosexuality Act. And the question is that possible without repealing the act? A lot of people think, no, you can't mitigate the act. It's criminal law. It applies to everybody. You can't waive it. You can't not implement it. And so as we speak, well, not as we speak, because it's already the evening time over there, but I know that there are meetings happening right now in Kampala between the bank and local CSOs in Uganda about this. And those meetings will involve direct communications between the government and the LGBT community, because the LGBT communities are stakeholders, and this process requires stakeholder engagement. And so we don't know where that will go. So that's the current status of things. Let me ask, El Salvador has been, the governments have gone up and down in terms of their support, and now it's down. Do you engage directly with the government? Does the bank facilitate this? How do you, when you engage as a stakeholder, how does that work?
Well, to give a context, previously, like in the previous government, we used to have certain spaces for dialogue with government institutions directly in high level. Let's say we could meet with ministers. But then since the government of Nayib Bukele took office, that started to change and the civic space started closing. And in that, at the same time came the opportunity for us to start doing advocacy with the World Bank, and we learned about this environmental social framework that we're talking about. And so that kind of opened the door for us to have certain spaces for dialogue with government institutions, because supposedly the institutions that are implementing projects of the World Bank are obligated to do consultations with the stakeholders. And because we have presented ourselves as stakeholders for certain projects, then they invite us to those consultations. Let's say that in the case of Amate, because we usually, before going to a consultation, we review the documentation about the project, or we do certain, or gather certain information about what the project is about, or how is the implementation going. We kind of have context before going there. But then for the majority of other CSOs that are invited, they usually don't have that context. And that's why they're probably get frustrated, because they don't know exactly what they are doing there. It's good that they get invited, but they just don't know exactly what they are doing there.
They show up because it's the World Bank, so you go to the building and
it sounds important.
Yeah.
So we should go. And like I said, it's probably a good thing, but at the same time, if like the CSOs or activists don't know exactly what kind of expectations they can have about the bank, it's probably not going to work. Like, for example, I don't know, like a month ago or something, we had a consultation about the new gender strategy that is that the bank is doing for in the international gender strategy. And there was a consultation on El Salvador, and there was LGBTI CSOs invited, and like for, I don't know, the majority of them, they were speaking about very specific issues on the country level. But the strategy itself was about more, global issues and how can certain things can be included or not. And so there was like the country representative for Salvador, and she kind of responded to the majority of the questions the CSOs had, but it was not the same for the team that was coming from here, from DC. So I believe that was probably one of the things that could be improved in those consultations. And one other thing that I want to mention is about when you engage as a CSOs in these environments where the civic space is closing, you know that you are taking risks, and because like retaliation can come from the government, and it doesn't usually have to be like and let's say, I don't know, an active retaliation. Sometimes it's more of a passive retaliation. So for example, we started doing this work actually with other LGBTI organization, and that other organization didn't want to continue because it thought that it could close their work that they were doing with certain institution. And we have continued doing it. But we know that if things get worse, which is probably what is going to happen, we might actually experience a retaliation in one way or another. So it's, for us, it's, I think, one of the main concerns that we have. And so far, even though the bank has told us in the past that we don't have to worry about that because the institutions know that they should not take retaliation against institution because there aren't really institutionality in the country, then we really don't have.
Yeah, I mean, next time you don't get invited to a meeting,
Yeah.
next time you don't get a particular grant, you don't know whether it's because at that meeting you sat across from the government and you were the troublemaker.
Yeah.
Can I
yeah.
add a little bit to that? And so just to note that the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, does have a zero tolerance policy to retaliation. And the World Bank has committed to zero retaliation, but is still working on kind of exactly what that looks like. Other institutions, as they're developing their own safeguards, the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, some of these development banks, since we're a few years after the ESF was approved, some of these institutions are putting in pieces around retaliation into their safeguards, which is fantastic to see. Again, the question always becomes how this is actually being implemented, what steps are these institutions actually willing to take with governments, but that is ramping up. So just wanted to add that.
I wanted to allow a lot of time for questions, but let me say that one of the things that we're trying to do here is to form a network of LGBTIQ groups in countries that borrow from the World Bank and train people in those countries on the World Bank process so that they can start engaging with that. It will not only be training advocates to engage, but in my experience, it's also going to be training the World Bank people to engage with us, because this is not a group of people that are very used to spending a lot of part of their job explaining themselves to people who aren't in the World Bank. And that's a skill, it's a teaching skill. And I would say for the most part, the World Bank doesn't have it yet. This is an institution where 20 years ago, there was a prohibition of employees at the World Bank, and they could not speak to civil society organizations. So this is a big flip.
Can I add that just in terms of framing, and I know then we're going to move to questions, but just kind of the three different levels for engagement to frame the discussion, and then happy to take any questions on that. So I just wanted to go through quickly again, because we're talking about how LGBTQI+ civil society organizations can come and have these conversations and dialogues with the bank. So I just wanted to run through those really quickly. One of which is the higher level policy consultations that are happening really from Washington, D.C., for example, on something like the gender strategy. And so civil society organizations can participate in online meetings, can submit written feedback on what they think needs to be improved in a particular policy strategy framework. That's more at the international level. Then we also have engagement, as I talked about before, on the country partnership framework. What is the lending going to look like in a particular country over the course of the 3 to 5 year period? That is another really great opportunity for civil society to engage. And then the level is really down at the project level. How does a project need to change? What should a project look like? And really on the project piece, that is when engagement at the earliest point possible. So really as early as possible in the design phase of a project, that's where you can be most successful in actually changing, expanding the scope of what a project might look like, making sure that particular groups are included, that kind of thing. So those are really the 3 different levels for engagement with the World Bank.
And even afterwards, you know, the COVID funding, the World Bank was a major funder, possibly the biggest funder of COVID vaccine distribution throughout the world. And in many countries, you would show up at a clinic, and standing outside that clinic would be a soldier. This was in El Salvador as well.
Yeah, totally.
And so what happened with that issue?
Well, that was actually the first project that we started monitoring the response of the government to the pandemic. And that was one of our main concerns about the use of security forces, especially the military, because, and I'm assuming this is probably the same for many countries, that security forces are, let's say, a concern for the LGBTI community, especially trans women. And the spaces to get vaccinated were not safe for them. And we have like multiple cases of trans women saying that they would go to the clinics, but they would see the military there, and they would say, oh, I will come back later or another day. But it happened the same thing. And so it was a barrier for accessing these vaccines. Then we engaged with the bank to raise this concern, and they met with the Ministry of Health, and they say they would take some measures on that. Let's say that the government currently has this kind of I don't know, a thing with using the military, especially for communication purposes, and they include it like in everything they can. If there is the pandemic, another pandemic coming, you'd say the military is going to save us. If there is a hurricane, they say the military is there to help us, and for everything. So, but they say they would use it only like for communication purposes and not like for the rest of the time. I guess that's improvement.
A little progress.
Yeah, but at the same time, communication obviously has an impact as well, especially if for a lot of people is the way they get to information, which is limited in our country as well. So I guess it's an improvement, but at the same time, challenges remain.
Yeah. Why don't we move to questions? If people have questions, and feel free to ask as basic questions as you want. When I was hired at Outright, I didn't know anything about the bank. But so help. How do I do this logistically? Yeah. Do I call on people? Line up at that thing and talk at the mic, and I'll go to this mic first.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Wheeler from the Solidarity Center. Special hello to Biljana. We're very proud to work with you in the Western Balkans. And so I'm here from the Global Labor Movement. And the trade unionist in me is wanting to push back on using GDP as our sole or primary indicator for economic inclusion. Because when I think of economic Yes, sorry. When I'm thinking of economic inclusion, I'm thinking economic justice. So not just that LGBTIQ people are being productive for the economy, but they are getting their fair share out of a growing economy.
Yep.
So I would like to ask panelists, anyone who'd like to chime in, what other indicators are we using for economic inclusion? What other indicators would you like to dive into more?
Yeah, honestly, I think we talk about GDP because the people that we're talking to are persuadable using that language as opposed to human rights language. And if I get the same result, I'll use whatever language I can. But GDP does not tell us about the condition of any single person in a country. Nothing. Because of inequalities and all kinds of things. It's that exact critique that in the 1980s formed the framework of human development. And human development says, let's not look at GDP, let's look at people, and let's measure success by how many opportunities they have, real opportunities, not just a law, a right, but to a job, but can you find a job this week? Can you go out and find an apartment now given your income? So it's the capabilities approach, but do you have the capability? And so theoretically, that's what it measures. And in order to have capabilities, we need a good health, we need knowledge, and we need resources. Those are the three components of the Human Development Index: life expectancy, income, education. And so the Human Development Index is supposed to communicate with one number, not GDP, but something about the status of humans. And of course, the professionals in the field don't use the Human Development Index. They use like the 200 indices that feed that because it's a blunt number. But yeah, GDP is where we've been, but it should not be our focus. Oh, sorry.
Hello. Hi, Suzanne Goldberg. Excuse me. Suzanne Goldberg. I am with the Office of the Special Envoy to advance the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons at the State Department. Very long title. I'm a legal expert there and senior advisor. Thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. I want to pick up on your point about education just now and your point about the 3 levels of engagement of entry points with the World Bank, and ask a question that actually comes from my prior experience at the U.S. Department of Education Civil Rights Office. Right, there's a tremendous amount out there about how to support inclusive educational environments for LGBTQI+ students. And my question, including a toolkit that we created at the Department of Education, but obviously a lot around the world. And so my question is, how can we be more effective at infusing those resources into all 3 of the levels you talked about? Because the resources exist, and not always, but not that people in any given room may not be aware of those resources. So what are the specific steps you would take to make sure that we can to help us get them in? And also, and I guess the side question, if you have time, is what's the interaction between the strategy level, the high level strategy, and then the project planning and the middle level country partnerships? Are there synergies there, or are they actually kind of functioning a little bit siloed? Thanks so much.
Let's take 2 other questions. I mean, you've been so many things in the movement, I even forgot about that one. But yeah, let's take 2 more questions here.
Okay, great. Hi, George. George Perlov. I'm representing Open for Business, which is a coalition of businesses that make the economic case for LGBT inclusion. I love this report that you mentioned in Macedonia and North Macedonia and Serbia, and the point that you were making before, Andrew, about that this shows, 1% GDP loss, and this is the kind of data that we work with, and we look at also, in addition to that, health inequities and also tourism issues and brain drain. And these are all, as we know, interrelated kind of issues. And I know this is a really important work that the World Bank has funded, but my question is, how do we get more of this in other countries? And so once we have data from a number of countries, and we can start to make bigger and broader generalizations. And what does that mean for what do we have to do as the NGO community? What does the World Bank have to do? What do businesses have to do? Here's our friends here at JP Morgan who are hosting us today, who I think really support this. So I guess the question is sort of how do we build on all of this to make this movement of data and showing the economic inclusion is important for everyone?
And one more question, and then our next round will be online questions.
Thank you. Adam Price. I'm a member of the Welsh Parliament. You mentioned that the situation in Uganda is unresolved at present, but when it does become resolved, is there potential for what is currently a temporary response to a specific case could become a new global precedent which could be applied then in other countries? And could that be relevant not just to countries like Ghana or Kenya, for example, that have similar legislation at various stages of the process currently being discussed, but also be the basis for the bank reevaluating the legitimacy of its lending policies in countries that arguably have environments that are just as hostile to LGBTIQ plus community, but where the legal basis is more historic rather than recent. And finally, I read that Uganda was now seeking to backfill effectively by talking to the Chinese Development Bank. You mentioned that other regional development banks in Africa and Asia were aligning themselves increasingly with progressive policies. Is anyone seeking to engage with the Chinese equivalent institution as well to make sure that they also live up to their responsibilities?
So a question about how to get expertise, for instance, from the education system into the stakeholder process, and how does that relate top to bottom? A question about how to get more data on economic outcomes and comparatives. Let me just say for Uganda, I don't really want to answer all of your questions because some of it involves choices in advocacy strategy, which I'd rather talk to you about when the cameras are not turned on. Uganda, the World Bank has looked at all the laws, and we are saying to the bank, Uganda is currently the worst law in the world. So it right now deserves unique and special treatment, and that it may or may not set a precedent. We'll see. And so, but I will tell you this, there has never been an attempt by a development bank to go through a formal stakeholder process. And that's what the World Bank is doing now in Uganda, is doing that with the LGBT community. The number one question that we all hear from all development agencies and humanitarian groups is, how do you engage the LGBTI community, particularly in hostile countries? And the World Bank is, for the first time, going to be the ones to answer that question, or at least try to, with a formal process. So what they are doing, that is extraordinarily precedent-setting. And that is going to have reverberations. The other two questions on stakeholder and data, and Biljana, if you want to.
I'll take a first pass at those.
Sorry, Andrew, what's the fastest way, because I see folks in line over here. Why don't we have Naomi and Julie on hold for the next round of questions along with the online ones, so that you don't have to stand in line if you don't want to, and we'll make sure that that Andrew comes back to you next.
Thank you. And I'm seeing the signs that we're 15 minutes left, so I will try to answer as quickly as possible. So in terms of using the resources that already exist and making sure that they're taken into consideration, I would say that oftentimes people are unaware of what the resources are that exist. And so raising those in these consultations, in these meetings, saying, hey, this is particularly relevant for this policy that is being developed, I think you should take a look at it. Some of this is different because the World Bank works differently from a bilateral agency or something along those lines, but trying to look at whatever resource that you're identifying as potentially helpful and saying, I would like you to take X, Y, and Z from this particular resource, and it needs to be changed by this, and this way, because the World Bank works differently. That is the most effective way to have those conversations and to engage. Oftentimes what happens is There's a lot of time spent reinventing the wheel. That is not an effective use of anyone's time. Let's use what's already out there, but say this is how it should change because the World Bank is different. And so raising those issues, the World Bank put together recently an inclusive education resource guide. And in some of the advocacy that we did there, we said these tools already exist. Just look at this and make some tweaks and pull that in, use that as a reference material. And so the more staff at the World Bank are aware of that, the better. I want to also really hone in on your second question, which was how is project planning and project implementation actually working in practice or not? What we are often seeing is that in many cases, while project documents are not as inclusive, as detailed as we would like them to see, they're often much better than project implementation. We're seeing a huge gap between what a policy says, what a project document says, and versus what is actually happening on the ground. That's why the more engagement at the country level, the better to say, this project is supposed to be designed in this way. Actually, it's impacting me. I am being left out. I have these problems with this particular project because of the way in which I'm interacting with it. So the more you can have that dialogue, really picking up that gap between design and implementation, the better.
And that essentially means somebody at the country level monitoring the project, literally standing outside of the doorway of whatever office you're talking about, seeing how things are going.
Yes, and so we have been working with Amate for 3 years to do just that in a couple of projects in El Salvador, because that's really the way to make change. In terms of building more data at the World Bank, I'm going to leave some of this piece to Biljana, but I wanted to add here that unfortunately there are limited resources. And that is one of the pushbacks we get a lot of time with the bank in terms of how much money is available for LGBTQI+ research. And the research is incredibly important, don't get me wrong. But what is happening with this research? That is one of the pieces that I think is incredibly important and often lost. The World Bank produces a lot of really great knowledge products, but they don't transfer into implementation. And so I want to make sure that as we're thinking about doing advocacy for additional research, we're also thinking about, okay, what impact is that actually going to have on the ground? How is that going to change a particular project in North Macedonia as a result of this new data? So I just wanted to add that piece, but Biljana, I'll turn to you first for the research piece as well.
Thank you, Rachel. The notes that I took to share, you actually shared them in front of me. Yes, that's true. So we have the reports and we have the knowledge products produced by the bank, but somehow it's expected that the NGOs will be only ones who will further engage in them with the states for that implementation. I want to answer on the question on these three levels. What can the bank do? What can the state do? And what can the businesses do? So first on the bank, I think, and I appreciate everything that Rachel said. And I think Amate has been so successful only because of your support, because BIC has such a good knowledge and thorough knowledge of the bank and all the opening spaces. However, there is a huge discrepancy across the regions, right? So LGBT organizations do not know how to engage with the bank on any of these three levels that Rachel you shared. And also in my research of the work of the World Bank, I analyzed several stakeholder engagement plans. In many different projects, in different topics, you will see that all disadvantaged and marginalized groups are put in one category. So that means they're put there, only some officer somewhere to tick a box that I have put the disadvantaged and marginalized group here, because in reality, it is impossible the same action, one action to have same effect to people for LGBTI and to ethnic minorities and to people with disabilities, etc. So that means that some team at the bank or at the borrower at the state did not think this thoroughly, how this action will impact. The second thing is the engagement with the bank. Again, I put the duty on the bank because the bank, what are the main objectives of the bank? They are ending extreme poverty, promoting shared prosperity, but they're embedded in the UN Leave No One Behind. So if the bank wants to make sure that nobody will be left behind, they need to make sure that we are involved in all three stages that you shared. And what we see here from the Global South, from the Eastern Europe is, yes, there is some involvement in the gender strategy, but again, that is such a big document with a rather vague language. So people, it's not easy to see where are we included in that document and who knows how that document will be implemented. But in the project level, as you also rightfully pointed out, where we can have actual impact in our villages, in our towns, we don't know where is the door to enter. And the bank needs to make sure that shows us how to participate in that process. On the states, I think it's important also, besides what was already shared, that they produce, first, that they implemented not discrimination legislation across the sectors, not just in labor, but in all sectors, all non-discrimination, discrimination to be fully implemented. And second, to produce disaggregated data. Our survey on cost of exclusion in Macedonia and Serbia brought clearly this as a recommendation, because the state does not know how LGBTIQ people are disadvantaged. And Rachel, I know you don't like this word, but they do like both marginalized and disadvantaged, because these words mean that these groups are left out of some developments because of factors who are outside of them. I don't like the word vulnerable, because that is the blame on us. But the blame is not on us that we are excluded from key development processes in the country. It's on the state, and they need to produce this data to understand how we are excluded and to create programs to effectively address address these gaps. And finally, for the companies, I think that companies need to be dedicated on making places LGBTI friendly. In the Western Balkans, again, we are witnesses of environment in the organizational workplace culture where sharing homophobic jokes, talking, gossiping about with homophobic narratives is normalized. And in that environment, people do not feel safe to come out. They do not feel safe to talk about themselves. In our analysis, again, with the business sector, we couldn't find more than few companies in the whole region that in their procedures explicitly put non-discrimination provisions for LGBTIQ people. So how can the employees feel safe to report cases of discrimination? And finally, we have documented cases of LGBTIQ people who have documented and reported discrimination based on the SOGI to their employers, and the employers did not react as by the law or to protect them, but they degraded them in the company. So these are only a few examples. I'm sure we can share much more, but the companies also have responsibility in this, and they must make the workplace LGBTI friendly and LGBTI respectful. And maybe, Andrew, if I can excuse myself, if there are no questions for me or no additional, because I need to go
with the vice president of somebody very important. I don't,
Good luck.
So thank you,
the EU ambassador.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you for.
Let me say this about data, which is a really important thing. Remember, the development process is you look at what you're trying to develop and you figure out what is happening there. If it's teaching a child to read, your data is, can the kid read a book? If you're looking to develop an entire country, your data is data that is representative of that country. So the World Bank works at a country level. That means the standard of data that is looking for is data that is representative of a country. Unfortunately, it is extraordinarily expensive and difficult for anybody that's not the government to get representative data. You can be a very large research firm, but for the most part, this representative data is going to be data that is collected by governments. So, you know, the research done in Western Balkans, et cetera, there's a lot of things to do to try to make it, but it doesn't fit the standard of good sampling, probability samples, representative data. And so that's what we're shooting for when we talk about the kind of data the World Bank uses. But we should not say that you need that data before you can do something, because you have data like the Western Balkans, you have the expertise of people who know what's going on and are just going to end up telling you the same thing you would know if you got the big data. So we want that big data, that representative data, but that should not stop us from taking action based on available evidence and expertise. We have, where is online? How do I get online questions?
Over there.
Okay.
So there's been a lot of conversation about kind of the precedents or space around revisiting loans for countries with existing anti-LGBT and criminalization laws, which I think, Andrea, you kind of spoke to about precedents, but maybe there's a little bit more there. And then I think to Jeff's question about kind of more economic justice and economic paradigm shifts, whether or not the World Bank is looking to kind of partner more with trade unions, feminist groups, economic and tax justice movements as a way to look at larger paradigm shifts rather than just at kind of this notion of kind of what inclusive economies is, given that often that still does exclude LGBTQ+ communities.
Well, I
Are
mean,
we
I'm just
having
gonna,
the other questions?
oh yeah, is there, why don't we take the two here, Julie and.
Hi, I'm Naomi Fine with Lesbian Global. And I have a question. I've heard the most recent response about knowledge and how important it is to look at what's the downstream impact of it. How do you want it to be used? I also recognize the importance of our coalition of global LGBT people, but I wonder if there's been any research specifically on LBQ women, because the intersectionality between the patriarchal discrimination and the discrimination as LGBT people makes us particularly outcast. I appreciate, Rachel, you saying we're not just vulnerable, but I think being outcast and being suppressed and oppressed in so many places does make us particularly vulnerable. And so I just wonder if you've contemplated or have already done research specifically on the economic impact and the Human Development Index for LBQ women.
Julie.
Hi, I'm Julie Dorff from with the Council for Global Equality.
Founder of our organization.
Very proud to be here. I have a really practical question. And first of all, kudos to Outright for creating this position with the wonderful Andrew Park and for venturing into the development space, in a really solid professional way. It's a huge gift to the movement. And thanks to BIC for working on LGBT issues for all these years. And we're seeing, some of the fruits of all of that labor. So thank you for that. The very beginning of the session, you said what the World Bank is and isn't, and very specifically wanted to address the myth that there's money to be had for our movement, through something other than government loans. And I'm curious, since there is more and more work happening across the globe of LGBT organizing towards development goals, right? So whether it's educational projects or health-related projects that are not HIV, et cetera, or just livelihoods, draw the link between what's happening in the lived reality of LGBT people's lives and attempts at fulfilling some of those development needs and this conversation. And if the World Bank is not the place for people to go for that particular work, talk about the bilateral development options and the other places outside of the human rights traditional funders for groups like that to look at. And then beyond that, how does that work relate to this conversation? Where are those inroads? Thanks.
I can say this, the UN Inclusion Index project looked for data on LGBT women in low and middle income countries and did not find a single representative data source on any LGBT women in any low or middle income country. That's 136 countries, nothing, zero. So just wow. And in many ways, I think when we talk about economic disparities between LGBT and non-LGBT, in large part, we're talking about economic disparities of women. I mean, this is an American framework where gay men are more favored than others, which isn't the case in other countries. But it just baffles me why there hasn't been more attention. But there hasn't. I don't think the World Bank is going to work in partnership with trade unions or anybody. I mean, they're going to say they are, but they'll work in partnership with people who demand being worked with in partnership. In terms of precedent of other countries that criminalize, et cetera, one thing is this. Before you cut off funding to a country, you want to ask the people in that country, is that what should be done? Last time around, the gay community in Uganda said, we do not want the World Bank to cut off funding. This time it was different. So the very first question is, what does the community there want, regardless of what precedent is going to be set? But secondly, we can't set a precedent to cut off all countries that criminalize. I mean, that would be devastating to the population, to the economy of the world. So that's the struggle. What precedent does it set? And how do you have integrity towards that policy and towards a precedent, yet not ruin and definance healthcare systems, et cetera? So whoever asked that question, sorry, that's all I could come up with. Do you want to answer any of the questions, or?
I just want to note that we are at time, and I'm going to be a little bit vicious because we don't want to hold people back from their lunch or their break. So please maybe take one more minute to wrap up.
Can I give each of you 30 seconds?
Sure. Yeah, and I just want to add about the discussion on, let's say, changing the paradigm on the language between development and human rights. I believe that it's not about the CSOs changing completely the language when we do advocacy with these institutions, but rather, let's say, broadening our language. But we have to keep pushing about inclusion, about justice, because it's not just adapting ourselves, but adapting these institutions to what we want. And also one thing that we didn't say that's important, language is not only words, but also the language that we speak. Because, for example, in countries where English is not the first language, documents are usually only in English. Or if you want to meet certain people, that people don't speak that language of that country, because we talked about projects, but the leadership of certain projects are not even in the country. They are usually in other countries. And so that's another barrier. And it's about language too.
Rachel?
I will be very brief, but Julia, I want to get a little bit at what you were saying in terms of the World Bank is not always the right actor to go to on certain issues. However, the World Bank can open a lot of doors. And so I want to leave everyone with, if you're struggling with getting in touch with your government, if your government is receptive to have these meetings and this is a safe place for you to engage, the World Bank can help open those doors. So for example, again, in an education project, you're trying to have a meeting with the education ministry and the education ministry continues to refuse to meet with you. Ask the bank for help. Can you please let me know the exact person I should be contacting within the Ministry of Education? I would like to have a meeting with them. Or can we have a joint meeting or something along those lines? So yes, the World Bank is not always the place to go to, but it can have a significant impact in opening doors, in enabling future advocacy and things along those lines. So I just want to leave everyone with that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.